The golden hues of the late afternoon sun stretched long across the quiet town park. A gentle breeze rustled the autumn leaves, sending them tumbling in lazy spirals over the cobbled pathway. Somewhere in the distance, the faint laughter of children echoed, a sound that once would have made William smile, but not today. At 73, William had seen his share of life. He had loved, he had lost, and somewhere along the way, he had let words slip from his mouth that could never be taken back. Now, as he sat on his usual wooden bench, hands clasped around an old faded letter, he wondered if life ever truly gave second chances. His fingers traced the worn edges of the paper. The ink had faded slightly, but the words he had once poured onto it remained clear. Words meant for someone who never read them. Someone who had once mattered. Someone he had hurt. With a heavy sigh, William looked up, his eyes following the figures moving through the park. A young couple walked past, lost in quiet conversation, fingers intertwined. An elderly man chuckled as he fed pigeons, unbothered by the world. Life moved on. Always. If only he could turn back time. Would he have done things differently? Would he have chosen silence instead of sharp words? Understanding instead of pride, just as the thought settled in. A voice he hadn't heard in years, broke through the air. William? Is that you? His breath hitched. That voice. Slowly, he turned his head. And there, standing just a few feet away, was John. Time had changed them both. The man before him was no longer the fiery, outspoken friend he once knew. His hair had turned silver, his face lined with years of experience, but his eyes, sharp, cautious, still held something familiar, something unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the past hung between them like an invisible wall. William's fingers tightened around the letter in his lap. His mind echoed a lesson he had once read in an old Buddhist text. Words can be medicine or a blade. Once spoken, they cannot be undone. And then came the real question, the one that had haunted him for years. Was it too late to mend? What had been broken? What do you think? Have you ever let words slip in anger only to regret them later? Have you ever lost someone? Not because you didn't care, but because you didn't know how to say the right thing at the right time? And if life handed you a second chance, would you take it? Tell me, have you ever been in William's shoes? If you had the chance to rewrite the past, what would you say? Share your thoughts below. Stay with me, because this story is only beginning. In the next part, we'll uncover the true power of words, how they can heal, or how they can quietly destroy. The power of words and self-control. William sat in the park, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. The sight of John standing before him stirred something deep inside, something raw, unresolved. The past had a way of creeping back, when least expected, and now, face to face with an old friend he had once pushed away, William was forced to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. Words, once spoken, could never be taken back. He had learned that lesson the hard way. It wasn't one single moment that had defined him, but a lifetime of small, careless words, sharp remarks thrown in anger, criticisms disguised as concern, silence when kindness was needed most. He had always prided himself on being an honest man, someone who spoke his mind. But honesty without compassion could be a cruel thing, and cruelty, even unintentional, left scars. He remembered the night with Eleanor, his wife, his anchor, the woman who had stood by him through every storm. It had been a simple argument, something trivial that should have been forgotten by morning. But in the heat of frustration, he had said something he could never take back. Maybe if you weren't so sensitive, we wouldn't have this problem. The moment the words left his mouth, he saw it. The flicker in her eyes. the way her shoulders tensed. She didn't yell, didn't fight back. She simply turned away, retreating into silence. And that silence lasted far longer than any argument ever could. Years later, after she was gone, William replayed that moment over and over in his mind. He wished he had said something different, or better yet, said nothing at all, because sometimes silence was kinder than words spoken in haste. Then there was Michael, his son, stubborn like his father, independent, determined. William had wanted the best for him, but his way of showing love had been through expectations. Through telling Michael what he should do rather than listening to what he wanted to do. When Michael had told him he was leaving his corporate job to pursue photography, William had scoffed. "That's not a real career," he had said. "You'll regret this." Michael's face had darkened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, packed his bags, and left. For years, their conversations were stiff, strained. Words, once used as weapons, had built an invisible wall between them. And William, too proud or too ashamed, never found the right words to tear it down. Sitting there, looking at John, William saw echoes of his mistakes. He saw every friendship, every relationship that had suffered because he had let his mouth speak before his heart had time to listen. He thought of the many times he had mistaken bluntness for wisdom, forcefulness for strength. He had spent a lifetime believing that saying what he thought was a sign of character. But what he had never realized, at least not until now, was that the true measure of a man was knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. His mind drifted to something he had read in a book on Buddhist teachings years ago. Words should pass through 3 gates before they are spoken. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? He had failed all 3 tests more times than he could count. John cleared his throat, shifting slightly on his feet. There was an awkwardness between them, a hesitation neither man knew how to overcome. And in that moment, William understood something he wished he had learned decades earlier. The hardest thing in the world wasn't speaking. It was choosing not to. The urge to defend himself, to justify his past actions, to explain why things had happened the way they did. It was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, but he swallowed it down. Because this time, words wouldn't fix anything. Not yet. So instead, he did something that felt foreign to him. He simply nodded and said, "It's good to see you again, John." John's expression softened, and for the first time in years, William felt something shift. A crack in the wall he had built. Words had created the distance between them. Perhaps silence could start to bridge it. Mastering emotions and temper, William had spent much of his life believing that strength came from standing firm, from speaking his mind without hesitation. He had always prided himself on being a man who did not hide his thoughts, who never backed down from an argument. But as he grew older, he began to see the damage left in the wake of his temper. The broken relationships, the lingering silences, the people who had once been close but had drifted away. And now, as he sat across from John, the weight of his past pressed down on him heavier than ever. Anger was a strange thing. It came in different forms, quick and fiery, slow and simmering. It could be loud and explosive, or quiet and corrosive, eating away at the foundations of love and trust without a single word spoken. William had known all of these forms, had let them control him more times than he cared to admit. He had learned the hard way that anger was like fire. It could provide warmth, but if left unchecked, it would consume everything in its path. He thought back to the night he had truly understood the cost of his temper. It had been years ago, during a heated argument with his wife Eleanor. She had been upset about something. He couldn't even remember what anymore. That was the cruel irony of anger. The reasons often faded, but the wounds remained. He had been tired, impatient, unwilling to listen. And so he had snapped. He had raised his voice, let frustration take over, and before he knew it, words had left his mouth that he could never take back. Eleanor had gone silent. Her face had not twisted in rage or defiance. There had been no shouting match, no dramatic response. She had simply turned away, retreating into herself. That night, she had gone to bed without a word, and though they had spoken again the next day, something between them had changed. A distance had settled in, subtle but undeniable, like a crack in glass that spread with time. It was only after she was gone that William had truly understood the depth of that moment. Then, there was Michael. His son had inherited his father's stubbornness, but unlike William, he had learned to walk away from conflict rather than fight through it. That had been their greatest difference. William had always believed that problems were meant to be confronted head-on, that silence was a form of weakness. So when Michael had made choices that William did not approve of, he had confronted him the only way he knew how, with sharp words, with disapproval, with the belief that his authority as a father was enough to steer his son in the right direction. But Michael had responded with silence, not in defiance, not in anger, but in quiet resignation. And then, one day, he had simply stopped coming home as often, stopped calling as much. William had watched the distance grow, had felt the sting of absence, but had been too proud to say what truly needed to be said. I was wrong. I should have listened. I should have tried to understand. Pride and anger often walked hand in hand, and together, they built walls that were hard to tear down. It was only after Eleanor's passing that William had begun to search for something, some form of peace, some way to make sense of everything he had lost. That was how he had found himself sitting in a small Buddhist temple one rainy afternoon, listening to the words of an old monk who spoke with the kind of calm that William had never known. The mind is like a pond, the monk had said. When anger stirs the water, everything becomes muddy, unclear. But if you wait, if you do not react, the water settles, and clarity returns. William had carried those words with him ever since, repeating them in his mind whenever he felt his temper rising. And now, sitting across from John, he felt the old instinct creeping back, the urge to defend himself, to justify the years of silence, to explain why things had turned out the way they had. But he stopped himself. He took a deep breath, just as he had learned to do, and let the moment settle. For the first time in his life, he understood that mastering one's emotions was not about suppressing them, nor was it about never feeling anger. It was about choosing how to respond, about understanding that in the space between impulse and action, there was power. He thought about all the times he had spoken when he should have stayed silent, all the moments when anger had felt like strength, but had only pushed people further away. And he realized, perhaps too late, that real strength was in restraint, in patience, in knowing that not every battle needed to be fought. John shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. The years had aged him, but William could still see the traces of the friend he had once known, the man who had stood by him through so much, until the night they had let their tempers get the best of them. The details of their argument had blurred with time, but the result remained the same. Two stubborn men, too angry to back down, too proud to apologize. William exhaled slowly. "It's been a long time," he said, his voice steady. John studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, it has." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't heavy with resentment or unsaid accusations. It was something else, something closer to understanding. William knew there was more to say, that there were years of distance to bridge. But he also knew that, for now, this was enough. Because in that moment, he had chosen something he hadn't before. He had chosen not to let anger define him. He had chosen restraint over impulse, patience over pride, and for the first time in a long time, He felt something he hadn't expected. He felt free. The philosophy of a peaceful life. The days had grown quieter for William. Not just in sound, but in the way time seemed to stretch, unhurried, like the gentle ripples of a pond untouched by wind. He had always imagined that old age would bring a kind of natural wisdom, that with enough years behind him, clarity would come effortlessly. But clarity, he had learned, was not a gift of time. It was something earned, through reflection, through acceptance, through the willingness to let go of the things that no longer serve the soul. For most of his life, William had been at war with something: expectations, regrets, the relentless need to control the world around him. He had carried the weight of his past mistakes like stones in his pockets, mistaking them for lessons when, in truth, they were only holding him down. But the more he sat with his thoughts, the more he began to see the truth in something he had read once. The root of suffering is attachment. He thought of Eleanor. He had loved her deeply, but love, he now understood, was not about possession. It wasn't about who was right or wrong, about proving a point or winning an argument. It was about presence, about being there, fully, in each moment, before time stole it away. How many nights had he wasted stewing over trivial frustrations, when he could have been watching the way the evening light softened her face? How many times had he let pride hold his tongue, when a simple, "I'm sorry," could have bridged the silence? Now, in the quiet of his home, where her absence was as loud as her presence once was, he understood. He understood that nothing was truly his to keep, not time, not love, not even the people he had thought would always be there. And yet, there was peace in that realization, because if nothing was permanent, then neither were his regrets. He could let them go. He could free himself from the weight of what could have been, and simply exist in what was. Simplicity. That was the lesson he had spent a lifetime overlooking. He had spent years chasing things: status, financial security, the illusion of control, believing that they would bring him peace. But now, in his old age, he found more contentment in the smallest of things. The way the morning sun felt on his skin, the rhythm of his breath as he sat in stillness, the taste of warm tea on a cold day. None of it grand, none of it extraordinary, and yet, in those simple moments, he felt something he had spent decades searching for. Enough. It wasn't that life had become easier. The aches in his bones were more pronounced. The days sometimes stretched too long. The nights, sometimes, felt too lonely. But instead of fighting against these things, instead of wishing they were different, he had begun to meet them with acceptance. He had learned that peace wasn't found in avoiding discomfort, but in surrendering to the truth of it. Impermanence. That was another lesson life had carved into him, whether he had wanted it or not. Everything changed. The seasons shifted. Friendships faded. People came and went. Nothing remained the same, not even himself. There had been a time when that thought terrified him. He had spent years resisting change, clinging to the past, believing that if he held on tightly enough, he could stop things from slipping away. But life had never worked that way. And now, instead of fearing impermanence, he had begun to see it as a kind of mercy. Because if everything changed, then pain was never permanent. Grief softened over time. Anger lost its edge. The things that once seemed unbearable became lighter, more distant, until they were nothing more than memories, carried by the wind. And if everything changed, then that meant he could change too. He was not bound to the man he had been yesterday, or the mistakes he had made years ago. Each morning was a chance to begin again, to approach life with softer hands, with a gentler heart. He had started speaking less, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that silence often held more wisdom than words. He listened more to the people around him, to the sounds of the world, to the quiet voice within himself that he had spent years drowning out. He found that in listening, he understood more, and in understanding, he judged less. He no longer sought to be right. He no longer needed to win arguments, to have the last word, to prove his point. What did it matter? How many moments of joy had he sacrificed at the altar of pride? How many conversations had he turned into battles, only to realize years later that the victories had been hollow? Now, when faced with conflict, he simply asked himself, does this truly matter? And more often than not, the answer was no. John had taught him that, or rather, their years of silence had. Sitting across from his old friend after so many years, William had felt the old defenses rise in him, the instinct to explain, to justify, to rehash the past. But instead, he had chosen something else. He had chosen peace, and in doing so, he had found that forgiveness was not something another person had to grant him. It was something he had to grant himself. As he sat in the park one afternoon, watching the wind play through the trees, he realized something simple, but profound. Peace was not something to be found outside of himself. It wasn't waiting in the future, in some perfect version of his life, where everything had fallen into place. It was here, in this moment, in the air filling his lungs, in the warmth of the sun, in the stillness of his heart. And perhaps that was all he had ever needed. Love and forgiveness. The first time William truly understood the weight of forgiveness, he was standing in his kitchen, staring at the phone in his hands. The number on the screen was one he had memorized long ago. His son's. Michael. How many times had he hovered over that call button, hesitated, and then put the phone down? Too many to count. It had been years since their last real conversation. Not the obligatory birthday calls, not the polite exchanges during the holidays, but an actual, meaningful talk. And it all traced back to one moment, one careless sentence spoken in frustration. You'll regret this. Michael had been young, full of dreams William hadn't understood. When he had walked away from a stable career to chase something uncertain, William had reacted the only way he knew how. With warnings, with doubt, with words meant to protect but delivered with too much force. At the time, he had convinced himself he was acting out of love. But love, when weighed down by control and fear, had a way of turning into something unrecognizable. Now, standing alone in the quiet house, he saw it differently. Love wasn't about being right. It wasn't about shaping another person's life to fit into a vision of what was safe, or logical, or familiar. Love was about allowing someone to make their own mistakes, allowing them to grow in ways that might be uncomfortable to watch, allowing them the space to come back in their own time, without resentment waiting at the door. He exhaled and pressed the call button before he could talk himself out of it. The phone rang once, twice. Then came the familiar voice. Dad. For a moment, William forgot how to speak. The voice on the other end sounded cautious, uncertain, just as hesitant as he felt. How long had Michael been waiting for this call? Had he, too, spent nights debating whether to reach out, only to be held back by something neither of them could name? Michael, William said, the name feeling both foreign and familiar in his mouth. He cleared his throat. How have you been? There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. That's a new one. William frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Michael said softer this time. It's been a long time since you asked me that. William's grip on the phone tightened. He thought about all the years he had spent being angry, not at Michael, but at himself, for not knowing how to be the father his son had needed. And what had all that pride earned him? Time lost, words left unsaid, a distance that had only grown wider. I know, he admitted, and I'm sorry. Silence. But not the kind that carried resentment. It was softer, filled with something unspoken yet understood. And then, just as quietly, Michael said, "I know. That was the thing about forgiveness. It was never about erasing the past. It was about choosing not to carry its weight forward." William had learned that lesson in other ways too. He had once been a man who held on to grudges, mistaking them for principles. If someone hurt him, he held on to that pain, keeping it like a stone in his pocket. Something to remind him why certain people could never be trusted again. He thought it made him strong. But time had shown him otherwise. Resentment was a prison. It built walls, high and impenetrable, and convinced the one inside that he was protected. But protection was not the same as peace. And peace, William had come to understand, could only be found through letting go. That was why, when he saw John again after so many years, something inside him had shifted. He had spent years blaming his old friend for their falling out, replaying their last argument in his head, convincing himself that he had been the one wronged. But when he saw John standing before him, older, different, yet somehow the same, the anger he had once held on to so tightly felt unnecessary. Time had softened everything else. Why not this? And so he had chosen love over pride. He had chosen to let the past rest. Not because John had asked for forgiveness. Not because the argument didn't matter. But because he no longer wanted to carry it. As he walked through the park that evening, William noticed a young woman sitting on a bench with a child in her lap. She was gently braiding the girl's hair, her hands careful, patient. The child, no more than 5, turned her face up and beamed at her mother. The kind of unguarded joy that only children had. Love, William realized, was in the small things. In the way hands worked gently through tangled strands of hair. In the way a voice softened during an apology. In the way a grudge was released. Not because the past had changed, but because the heart had. It had taken him decades to learn what love really meant. Not possession, not control, not perfection, just presence, just forgiveness, just allowing the people he cared about to be exactly who they were, and meeting them there, with an open heart. And so, as he headed home, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Michael. A picture. A landscape captured in stunning golden light. Beneath it, 2 simple words. Thank you. Wisdom and kindness. William had spent most of his life believing that kindness was simple. That doing good for others was always the right thing. That generosity and love, when freely given, would always be appreciated. But time had shown him that kindness, when not paired with wisdom, could be exhausting. It could drain a person until there was nothing left to give. It could be taken advantage of, twisted into expectation rather than gratitude. He had learned this lesson in quiet, painful ways. There was a time when he had helped a neighbor, Mr. Lawson, an elderly man who had struggled with his daily errands. At first, William had been happy to lend a hand, picking up groceries, driving him to appointments. It felt good to be useful, to offer his time to someone in need. But over time, the requests grew more frequent, more demanding. The gratitude in Mr. Lawson's voice faded, replaced by assumption, as if William's help was no longer an act of kindness, but an obligation. One day, when William was running late to a doctor's appointment of his own, he had apologized for not being able to drive Mr. Lawson to the post office. The old man had scoffed. "I thought you were better than that." The word stung, but more than that, they opened William's eyes. He had spent years believing that selflessness was always noble, that it was his responsibility to give, to serve, to sacrifice. But what he had never realized was that kindness, without boundaries, could become something that harmed rather than healed. That was when he understood a truth he wished he had learned sooner. Kindness should never come at the cost of one's own well-being. He thought back to Eleanor. She had been the gentlest person he had ever known, but she had also been wise. She had always told him, "Giving is good, but never give so much that you lose yourself in the process." He had never quite understood what she meant. Not until now. It was not unkind to say no. It was not selfish to recognize when giving became draining. A full cup could pour into others, but an empty one had nothing left to give. He thought of Michael, his son, and how their relationship had changed over time. There had been a period when William had tried too hard to make up for his past mistakes. Offering money, giving advice that wasn't asked for, showing up unannounced. It had come from love, but it had suffocated rather than strengthened their bond. One evening, Michael had sat him down and said, "Dad, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't need you to fix everything for me. I just need you to be here." That was the moment William realized that kindness was not about doing the most. It was about knowing what was truly needed. Sometimes, love was in action, in service, in giving. But other times, love was in restraint, in stepping back, in trusting that the people he cared about could stand on their own. He had seen this lesson play out again when he reconnected with John. There had been a part of him that wanted to fix everything all at once, to smooth over the past with grand gestures. But John had needed time. He had needed space. And William had learned to respect that. Love, he had come to understand, was not just about presence, it was about balance. Now, as he walked through the park, watching the sun dip behind the trees, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He had spent so much of his life trying to be everything for everyone, trying to be a protector, a provider, a fixer of problems. But real wisdom, he now knew, was understanding that kindness did not mean losing oneself. It did not mean saying yes to everything, or giving until there was nothing left. It meant knowing when to give, and when to let go. And for the first time, he was ready to let go. Not of love, not of kindness, but of the idea that he had to bear the weight of the world alone. As he sat down on his usual bench, he noticed a small, folded piece of paper in his pocket. It was from Michael, written in his familiar handwriting. "You taught me a lot, Dad, but the greatest lesson was this. You don't have to do everything to be loved. Just being here is enough." William smiled, his heart light. Kindness was not about how much one gave, but how wisely one gave it. And love was not about how much one did, but simply about being there. The lonely bench was lonely no more. The late afternoon sun stretched golden ribbons across the park, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. William sat on his usual wooden bench, the one that had witnessed years of his solitude, his regrets, and his quiet reflections. But today, something felt different. For years, this bench had been a place of contemplation, a place where he sat, burdened with the weight of his past, with unspoken words and unmended relationships. It had been a place where he questioned, was it too late? Could broken things ever be made whole? But now, as he looked around, he realized that the loneliness he had carried for so long had begun to dissolve. Next to him sat John, his old friend. There was no longer any tension in the air between them. No unspoken resentment. They had not needed to dissect the past to move forward. Forgiveness had come not through words, but through time, through presence, through the quiet understanding that life was too short to hold on to anger. Across from him, on a nearby bench, Michael sat with his camera, adjusting the settings as he prepared to capture the golden hues of the evening. William watched his son with a quiet kind of pride. Not the pride of ownership, of control, but the pride of witnessing someone he loved flourish in their own way. They no longer filled their conversations with expectations or past disappointments. They simply talked about the small things, about the present, about life as it was now. And somehow, that was enough. For so long, William had believed that making things right meant doing something big. An elaborate apology, a grand gesture, a complete undoing of the past. But he had learned that healing didn't work that way. It wasn't in grand moments. It was in the small ones. In the quiet patience of forgiveness. In the choice, each day, to let love be bigger than pride. He had spent his life thinking he had all the answers. That wisdom came with age. That experience alone was enough to make a man understand the world. But the greatest wisdom he had learned in his later years was this. Love, in all its forms, is not about control. It is not about being right. It is about presence. For the first time in a long time, William felt light, not because life had suddenly become perfect, not because time had erased his past mistakes, but because he had finally let go of the things that no longer served him. He leaned back, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. The bench beneath him was still the same, but he was not. And just like that, the bench that had once been filled with loneliness was lonely no more.